King's Field is a definitive piece of FromSoftware history, and yet it still seems like not very many people are talking about it. Then again, that could be said about many early FromSoft games like Echo Knight, Evergrace, Lost Kingdoms, all the 97 other ones, most games before Demon's Souls that aren't Armored Core. I guess in that regard, King's Field is one of the most talked about early FromSoftware franchise, but that's still not going to stop me from talking about it today. King's Field 1 in particular is a game that is yet to see a Western release to this day, which makes sense given it was FromSoftware's first commercial title. They probably didn't want to take the risk or put in the large amount of efforts it would have taken to localize for Western audiences. So King's Field 1 is stuck in limbo, but thankfully having an easily accessible fan translation for English players. Even so, the original King's Field 1 isn't super lore heavy, so for whatever reason you wanted to play the original, you aren't missing out on much. But before we get into the game, I would first like to thank channel members Shavenger, Mega Roomba, Amar's channel, and Zap R. I'm shocked that there's people who even want to support the channel, so thank you very much. Your funding has allowed me to acquire this, well, even though I got this like over a year and a half ago, but damn. Ah, shit.
Released on December 16th, 1994, King's Field was an early PS1 title, and it really shows. Given that King's Field 4 was a soft reboot, King's Field 1 obviously starts a different storyline of the Kingdom of Verdite, which spans across the first 3 entries and is rather vague and underdeveloped in the first entry. Whatever story is here is pretty bare bones and mostly world building or simply name-dropping people or places in the story. The story of King's Field 1 follows John John Forrester, son of Hauser Forrester, commander of the Royal Guard of the Kingdom of Verdite. Surrounding Verdite is a vast forest, home to a large sanctuary built to honor a long-lost hero of a great war long past, who came to be known as the Dragon of the Forest, who presumably was very powerful and controlled magical artifacts that lie buried within its sanctuary, provoking the greed of mankind. One clan seized power over the sanctuary and used it to rule Verdite for centuries, transforming the sanctuary into a royal graveyard while secretly searching for the sacred artifacts. During one of these expeditions, the soldiers never returned, prompting the king to send in Hauser with a large group, only to be destroyed by the newly rose monsters residing within the graveyard, which led John to enlist as a mercenary to find his father. That's the general preface given to the player in both the manual and partially during an intro text crawl, but we should also note that the second last king, Randolph VIII, was mysteriously killed and possibly poisoned by his successor despite his great powers, hinting towards some possible corruption with the current royal leaders and an explanation to why the expeditions have gone awry. We'll go more into story as the game progresses, but this is sadly the majority of lore within King's Field. The story is more there as flavor to justify the gameplay and setting, without much effort to build up a larger plot because this was FromSoftware's first commercial game, and they were probably not expecting to turn it into a series. The game opens up to John Fields teleporting down to the first floor of the Royal Graveyard, who turns left and... It's a classic FromSoft tradition to be able to easily die right from the start of the game. King's Field does not hold back or fuck around. The early game is a challenge in itself with how outmatched you are by the enemies, showcased by a single skeleton being able to absolutely rock the player in almost one hit. This is just one aspect of King's Field's difficulty. The early game isn't the most challenging just because of the enemies being a higher level than you. There's also the slow, awkward movement you have to get used to, the brief attack animations with lingering and large hitboxes that lead you to get hit outside of where you'd expect, and traps that can easily one-shot you. This all adds to an oppressive and gloomy atmosphere of the royal graveyard where you really feel outmatched and unwelcome, like the whole place has been reclaimed by darkness with your player ill-prepared to combat it. Aided by the fact that save points are few and far between, easily missable for the first hour if you aren't thoroughly searching for one, leading to one mistake or taking on a threatening enemy recklessly will set you all the way back to the beginning. From this you learn that Kingsfield is a methodical and careful game. You can start to learn the enemy timings and combat mechanics pretty easily. You can gauge how tough an enemy is based on where it is and what it looks like. But even when you get used to all that, the threats still remain. You've just gotten more skilled, much like your character. Yet death still lingers around every corner. Kingsfield is not an absurdly hard or brutal game, it just respects the player's skill and intelligence. It forces you to adapt and learn quickly, much like other classic dungeon crawlers of the time. This is present not only in the combat system, but the other major gameplay aspect of Kingsfield as well, being exploration. You're dropped into the royal cemetery with absolutely nothing except a short sword. You have no map or any other helpful equipment, all of which you need to find yourself. Right from the get-go, the dungeon is very open-ended, offering you many different paths to explore, some of which lead to traps, locked doors, or chests, or intricate tunnels overrun with creatures. Getting hit by all of these options at once may be overwhelming, but allows the player to forge their own path and explore each segment piece by piece, having to mentally map out the sprawling dungeon and keep track of any secrets they find they can't access yet. Eventually, you do get access to a map about halfway into floor 1, but most maps are incomplete and confusing to look at until you've thoroughly explored the area yourself. Sometimes I found the map to be less helpful and disorienting when I'm trying to explore a new floor, so mentally mapping still reigns supreme as you can't rely solely on your map at all times. This goes for extensions of the graveyard that aren't fully charted out, or completely hidden areas like these dragon doors that you need to manually keep track of since you can't open them until the endgame. There are tons of other hidden walls spread throughout the graveyard. Hidden walls behind hidden walls, an entire labyrinth of rooms separated by dozens of hidden walls that have nothing noteworthy in them. Skeletons behind hidden walls, all seamlessly hidden in plain view for you to discover. These are the most rewarding parts of exploration, not only with the satisfaction of finding a hidden door, but they usually have useful items for your stage of progression. One incredibly powerful shadow blade is locked behind a hidden wall, behind a hidden wall, behind a hidden wall, in a small nook in a series of corridors. There's even the debut of the Triple Fang hiding somewhere I couldn't even find that I only know about from old online maps, alongside plenty of regular gear upgrades that you can only unlock through exploration, so it's very much worth it. Back to the dungeon, we've explored a fair bit of the crypt and stumbled upon our very first NPCs, a priest named Judas Cross and Ozzy Randallgrave, the Gravekeeper. The priest tells us he's missing his cross so he can't help us, while Ozzy, the beautiful shirtless fellow, mentions both a map and key we have yet to find, giving us somewhat of a goal to work towards, as many doors and chests we've stumbled across have been locked. While not much, the NPCs in this game actually have a fair bit of dialogue, more than you'd expect at least, having a few different lines at first, then usually more after some stages of progression. Like I said, it's not much, but it's pretty much the only world building that Kingsfield has. For instance, Ozzy eventually tells us more about our father, while much later in game there will be more substantial dialogue from other NPCs. Without the grave key, we take an awkward side path to get into the commoner's graveyard. While some doors in this place remain locked, we actually have means to get around them indirectly through the interlinked nature of Kingsfield's map. There are multiple locked doors you can get behind on just the first floor alone through alternative paths, making the deceased's key you unlock later double its use from just a regular key to also unlocking shortcuts. It's like a reward for diligently exploring. You spent the time learning and traversing the whole area, now you can easily backtrack through it. Backtracking is commonplace in Kingsfield because there are more locked chests you stumble across than pixels on the wall. Some you can't open until near the end of the game even. I feel sometimes there are too many locked chests you find, because you'll have moments where you find nothing but 3 subsequent locked chests, some of which might be behind traps or locked doors even, which just completely disregards the exploration and effort you put in to find what is essentially no reward. These locked chests would be better if they had valuable items in them, but most of them hold Verdite gems, or phantom rods. Not entirely bad rewards until you're 10 Verdite gems deep from just floor 1 to 2 chests you waited 6 hours in game to open. Phantom rods would be useful if they lasted longer than me in bed with a rock golem, They essentially show you hidden walls, but they're single use and too short lasting to feel like a good reward from a locked chest. As I eloquently put it on stream, this game has like anti-fucking satisfaction. Every single fucking door is locked in this game. Every single chest is locked in this game. And guess what? You're never finding the key. But besides this, exploration in Kingsfield is one of its strongest suits. You can still get some good items from chests, and the other most important items are found from more hidden places. In order to get the Deceased's key, which allows us to leave the first floor, we need to get the priest his cross back, which is being sold by a spineless thief named Gil Bacchus, who intended to search for the magical artifacts hidden within the graveyard until monsters showed up. Since then, he's been too scared to leave. He actually sells some really good equipment for some high prices. This is one of the 2 shops in the game, although I never returned to Gil after I bought the cross because he's way too out of the way. Plus, I was already in my Kingsfield 4 mindset of you usually find better equipment in exploration than you do in shops. I was partially correct because you do eventually find the same equipment he sells from monster drops or around floors 3 to 4, but it does take a while for that gear to become outdated, so it's somewhat worth it. There's another merchant near the start of floor 1 that sells basic things like herbs and antidotes, useful items if you ever run out of them, especially for the early game, but I never bought anything from him either because I managed my resources well. There's a save point at a shop too, so you can save practically at the beginning of the game, whereas it took me an hour to find my first save point. There are few and far between crosses in Kingsfield that allow you to save your progress. They don't heal you or anything special, and their distant pacing adds the uneasy atmosphere of Kingsfield where you always have to be on guard. These save points, disallowing the player to save wherever they want, but still not being so inconvenient with the use of shortcuts, allows the game to keep its tension but not be brutally unforgiving. Before we give the priest his cross though, we have to put a dragon chalice upon its altar that we found on a random corpse in a monster tunnel. This chalice revives a dragon fountain near the beginning of floor 1 that completely heals your HP and mana, being one of the few means of actually doing so. This was about 2 hours into my playthrough, so up until this point I was completely magicless and had to rely on my limited healing resources to survive. This dragon fountain affects the gameplay much like the save points, not diminishing the tension as it's placed very near the beginning of the game, and if you wanted to replenish your mana all the way back from floor 3, you'd have to climb the entire way back manually depending on what shortcuts you have unlocked. So the player is still incentivized to conserve their MP, but use it sparingly to aid in combat or level it up. Leveling up magic eventually unlocks more spells, and as the game progresses, it gets more fun and powerful, but for now it's a tool that allows the player to stun enemies and get free hits in. Along our way to get the cross, we also happen upon a grave robber who mentions his missing son, who just so happens to be dead about 10 feet away on the left, and the guy is too stupid to notice. These are the people Ozzy mentioned earlier that he sold his map to, which we can pick up from the dead one, giving us the first and confusing Gravekeeper's map, which shows us most of the first floor but fails to document the various extra tunnels that the monsters themselves had dug out. This map surprisingly works between all 5 floors, to a lesser degree on the last 2, but at that point you get another map upgrade. I think it would have been better to have a separate map for each floor, as it could be a reward for completing said floor, but the current map system is way more convenient and still doesn't show everything on a floor, along with being a bit overwhelming and confusing to look at like I've said earlier, so it's not a complete takeaway from the exploration of Kingsfield. When we finally return the cross to Judas, he thanks us by giving us the Deceased's key, which allows us to unlock most of the doors in the Commoner's graveyard. This allows us to access a hidden area with a switch that disables arrow traps that were once blocking access to floor 2, which one-shot us at such a low level. Entering floor 2, we're met with foreboding background music, stronger enemies than what we're used to, poop rock golems, and a large sprawling map. This time more clearly segmented into 4 distinct areas. This map is probably the least confusing to look at, but is still quite fun to explore with its hidden pathways that link a few of the different segments together in unique ways, and the introduction of new traps and puzzles. For starters, we now have bottomless pits which do what you'd probably assume, instantly kill you upon stepping watching over them by sending you into the depths of Shadow Tower. There's also large moats of darkness blocking us from descending into floor 3. Seemingly impassable, it's a wonder as to how we're even supposed to get past them, or why this is even here when this place is supposed to be an accessible royal graveyard for kingdom workers. Before this floor, the map design felt very organic, giving the feeling of a realistically designed underground graveyard with actual purpose in its design. Some segments being made for people to actually live in, such as the church, or places clearly designed for burials and left neglected to time. The shortcuts play a huge part in making the map flow naturally as well, turning what would otherwise be an awful to navigate cemetery into an efficient place designed for people to do their jobs or traverse through. In that regard, it also makes you feel like you're taking back the graveyard from the monsters that have overrun it and made it into a hostile place, who've probably contributed to adding these death traps and bottomless pits to impede people. The map design of Kingsfield remains to be good after the first floor, it just slowly starts to make less sense being a royal cemetery with swinging spiked balls and traps everywhere. Floor 2 is also not quite as large as Floor 1. It still has 4 noteworthy segments, but has more dead space in between that makes it not have as much to talk about. What we do have is an actual developed burial hall that is more sophisticated than the sporadic commoner's graveyard. This is where nobles and knights in service of the king were buried. This brings up each tier of the graveyard, even though we haven't seen them yet. It's peculiar how each level past this is dedicated to people who probably change all the time. Consider the 3rd level, Graveyard for Aids to the King Before Last King, which is already a bit of a mouthful. So this is the place where they bury specifically only aids to the second last king, with aids to the last king being right below. What? Every time a new king is enacted, do they just shift these people up a level? What happens to the aids of the second last king? Do they just get buried somewhere else or thrown out to the surface? Why not make 3rd level for aids, 4th level for previous kings, and 5th level for the last king? Where does the last king go when he's no longer the last king? That's enough for that stupid tangent, but it's really funny to think about a massive 3-level excavation operation of moving dozens to hundreds of bodies every couple of decades based on how these places are named. In reality, the devs probably just didn't think about it because why would you? It's stupid and nobody cares about it except for me because this is 50% of Kingsfield 1 lore there is to speculate on. Back to the actual game, we're introduced to these weird floating ghosts that constantly laugh at you, feeling kind of out of place and more like a cursed entity that exists just to make your game dark. There's also a prison adjacent which exists to house rock golems. For their crimes of constantly shuffling back and forth, these golems were given a permanent life sentence in the slammer. These rock golems are so goofy. They slam down violently when you kill them and sometimes just spin around when out of aggro range, which is quite funny considering that these are one of the few creatures canonically imprisoned in the Kingsfield universe. Poor guys probably just unluckily spawned in the prison while the rest of the monsters appeared in more useful places. This is probably why they jump down bottomless pits so much.
No, Ice Golem! You had so much to live for, why did you do it? Ice Golem, no!
The golems are not the only enemy with ridiculous or silly death animations. I failed to mention it up until this point because there really was no appropriate place to bring up goofy skeletons freezing in place and falling to pieces, or large snakes with humanly loud screams. Especially when most of the first floor was discussing the oppressive atmosphere and gloomy vibes of the gameplay. Now, none of this takes away from that, but Kingsfield can be a very unintentionally funny game at times. This goes for finding the grave robber's dead son 10 feet away from him, the goofy clown music of the later levels, dense NPCs and their weird names, or in this case, the death animations that are so simple to a comedic degree. One such dense NPC is a wizard named Raleigh Kelvin. Oh my god. Who is just chilling in a random floor 2 cave, raving about seeking the truth and only the truth. Who'll teach you powerful magics beyond your comprehension learned throughout a lifetime of dedicated research and practice. All in exchange for a mirror, of course. The mirror in question is a truth mirror you find randomly that has the sole purpose of...
Nah, I'm just fucking with you, gives NPCs a description.
You'd think this motherfucker would want one of your several immortality seeds or unlimited infinite power, but he just wants a mirror, probably so he can continue to gloat to himself about how much better he is than everybody else. The mirror is found somewhere in the northern graveyard of this level, if I recall correctly, which also has a peculiar hidden corridor near the end that contains a chest past an impassable bottomless hole. I spent a fair bit of time contemplating how to actually pass the hole, which isn't possible at this point, but keep this in mind for when it comes up again. Another similar question in my head was how the hell do you pass the huge gaps between walkways, as especially prominent in the northeast of the map, until I found a hopeless bard fiddling away at a magical harp that can ascend floating pathways out of the abyss below, in exchange for a dragon tree seed, a rare item that we've been collecting on our journey that fully heals our MP and health, much like the dragon fountain. The harp is definitely one of the weirder puzzles in the game. I don't know why a harp of all things allows you to pass over moats of darkness, but it does pop up again once or twice later, so it's not a complete throwaway mechanic. With harp in hand, we're able to access the third floor, which was the fastest of the first 4 floors to complete for me. The gimmick of floor 3 is that we find a dragon temple that's blocked off by magical walls that we can clear by placing 4 elemental seal stones. You actually find 2 of these seal stones on floor 2, and maybe without properly exploring, you could get very lost in this level hopelessly looking for 1 or 2 of the last seals on the 3rd floor when they might not be there at all. The rest of floor 3 is relatively linear corridors, along with the second last King's Burial, who is actually King Randolph VIII. We've heard about him in the manual, and he actually speaks to us in spectral form at his tomb, granting us his power of fire magics, giving us one of the few offensive spells in the game, which is a fireball far more powerful than our thin light needle. Randolph does not say much other than confirm our suspicions that the current or last king is responsible for the sad state of the royal catacombs, and puts his faith in us to defeat him. This floor also contains the Triple Fang, one of the few magical swords and a lasting staple of the Kingsfield series, as well as many hidden walls in a cool tunnel filled with new creepy wind mask traps that are resampled in Kingsfield 4, and possibly other entries as well. Other than that though, floor 3 is one of the shortest and most straightforward out of all the floors. Once you unlock all the seals, you gain access to another full heal, being the Dragon Shrine, but at this point in the game, we've unlocked enough shortcuts that link to the first floor, and backtracking to the Dragon Fountain is not as grueling. So the shrine is helpful, but not an absolute game changer. Floor 4 is where the real crazy stuff happens. If you were getting tired of the grading floor 3 loop, which is essentially the same 8 notes looped on repeat in what sounds like a beta passage of light, you're instantly slapped in the face with the most aggressive harpsichord loop and funky doom bass line that really represents the musical iteration of insanity. Floor 4 is already a confusing maze of granite walls and constant rock golems or traps in your way impeding your progress, but this 40-second loop makes the place into an actual nightmare. Floor 4 is the longest level, at least it feels that way when every second is being drilled into your mind by this atrocious loop, which for some reason has someone sneezing in the background every 20 seconds. At the same time, I love Floor 4 for its exploration. With how comfortable the player has gotten up until this point, having multiple heal spots and shortcuts, the game throws you for a loop with a dense convoluted maze with tons of options that confuse the player. And to top it all off, the game trolls you by making the map near useless. This floor is amazing in a gameplay perspective, bringing back the challenge that was mapping out Floor 1 with all the disorientation of finding your way in the winding paths of the royal graveyard. The enemies here, although looking the same, have gotten significantly tankier and could easily topple the player if they were careless even at this level where Floor 3 was a breeze. The game rubs this in your face with a ghost NPC that makes fun of your magic level, and another one that tells you your dad is dead. Lol. What the fuck, man? The deeper you get into Floor 4, the less it makes you want to leave and backtrack to your point of safety or healing. With how confusing the early parts of this map are, you're more incentivized to keep going so you don't lose your progress or spend more time overall in this intestine hellscape. After nearly an hour slowly dredging through harpsichord hell, we find ourselves in a hall outside of the tunnels. Thankfully, some cohesive architecture, and even better, a magician's map that actually gives us a sense of layout. Not before finding infinitely respawning crystal golems that hilariously spawn on screen. Are you fucking kidding me? He respawned on screen. You can't do that. That's not how it works. The Magician's map is an actual game changer. It showcases pretty much every unmapped hall from the previous Keeper's map, and nearly goes as far as to showcase some hidden segments of an area that you'd only be able to access through hidden walls, so it helps attentive explorers find even more secrets. This is not nearly the halfway point of floor 4, but it sure feels like a milestone now that we actually have a map. The rest of the floor is not nearly as chaotic of a mess. There are some more hilariously unanimated enemies that just fly up into the air absurdly high to jump attack you, and more treasures such as the dark katana mentioned way earlier that makes quick work of the otherwise tanky enemies that would make the area drag on longer. Eventually, we find the Dragon's Sword, on the most ornate grave in the whole game, which seems to be of our father's, mentioned by a dying soldier that the commander's weapon was left at his grave, meaning Hauser has left us a final gift we need to defeat this darkness. Before we descend into the 5th and final floor, we have some loose ends to be taken care of. The numerous locked chests from the past 4 floors that have been left behind can finally be opened, with either a 4th floor key or special items such as the feather boots that allow us to actually float over bottomless pits. This was a really neat solution to passing the traps that is never explained to the player. The feather boots are found in floor 4, around the Magician's map somewhere, and the only hint to their extra use other than pure armor is their name, with additional hints from the game that these pits are indeed intended to be passed over, with multiple chests and items being put past them. It's enough to infer that you can possibly use something like the feather boots, but it's a solution that's not directly in your face and feels like a very satisfying one because of that. Unfortunately though, many of these previously locked chests that need to be backtracked to mostly just hold Verdite crystals, which are pretty useful as they increase your magic level, but you aren't missing out on much by not getting them. Some chests do have useful gear that teaches you a new spell or also increases your magic stat, but these Verdite crystals are just a small bonus for backtracking. That's all we need from the previous floors. It's finally time to warp down to the bottom of the royal graveyard and put an end to this. My god, this place sucks. Not just the music or the sheer amounts of illusory walls that you wouldn't find without the help of the map, but also the overload of enemies meant to debuff you or launch tactical nukes at you. The game is not holding back at this point, and make sure you're tough enough for the final boss, otherwise a couple of explosions will smoke you instantly. It's also funny how progressively over the course of King's Field 1, the music has gotten noticeably worse with each floor. Now, I don't want to be too harsh on King's Field 1, because the music team consisted of only 2 people who, by the counts of later FromSoft titles, were not formally musically trained, at least in some aspects. On one hand, it's cool to see people just go absolutely ham and create the wackiest combinations of sounds you would never get from a professionally trained composer, but on the other, this makes the music very hit or miss. King's Field and its later titles do have some very good tracks, but it also has some horribly repetitive ones like these on the last 2 floors. You could possibly gaslight yourself and think that the music was made intentionally bad to give an oppressive atmosphere to this equally chaotic and abrasive area, but I think that's a bit of a stretch. Sure, the bad music does aid in the I want to get out of here as quickly as possible feeling, but I still don't think that positively affects the game. It just positively affects how quickly I decide to shut off the music. Now, floor 5 isn't all bad. Sure, you have almost complete darkness and a constant flurry of enemies throwing uranium at you, but there is a peaceful segment housing the fabled Dragon of the Forest from Legend, alongside a fairy we saw somewhere near the beginning of the game. I forgot to mention her and she's very forgettable, and I don't really care. With the power of the dragon and fairy, energy is restored back to the ancient dragon artifact, into the holy Moonlight Sword, the debut of the long-running staple of FromSoft games, unceremoniously clinks on the ground. With this, we can open up the hidden dragon doors we could find all the way near the beginning of the game, each housing very powerful pieces of equipment that will aid us in the final fight. The Moonlight Sword has the very useful property of steadily regenerating your MP, which allows you to use practically any magic without needing to constantly replenish it, which is especially useful paired with the sword's magic ability itself, a powerful bolt of magic that bursts into an explosion, dealing massive damage to anything in its blasts, even collateral damage to you. Sword magic is a hidden mechanic that only applies to 2 weapons as far as I know, the Moonlight Sword and the hidden Triple Fang. I already know about it from King's Field 4, but still had trouble figuring out how to actually cast sword magic for a good few minutes. If you didn't know about the mechanic, the final boss may be a bit of a hassle, as you can't even melee him, but having a reliable ranged attack makes this legendary sword even better. The final dragon item you can get is the Mist Crown, another powerful piece of equipment that slowly regenerates your health, turning you into a powerhouse that can keep adventuring without any need to backtrack to replenish your stats. This helm doesn't make us too overpowered though. It's not very quick and more of a safety net that can be broken with enough damage stacked at once, and doesn't save us from fall damage. You'd think that since there's a dragon door on floor 1, 2, 3, and technically 5, that there'd be one on floor 4 as well. Nope! But now, with all preparations made, we're finally ready to take on the final fight. Beforehand though is an invisible bridge we need to pass, another undisclosed secret that the player has to find out for themselves, behind a hidden wall no less. It's kind of hinted at by the fire particles outlining a pathway, but isn't quite clear until you have nowhere else to go to progress. Afterwards, we're teleported to an area with abnormally large enemies, then thrown into a room filled with the toughest enemies in the game, all spinning around and shooting mini nukes at you. Then finally we see the current king, petrified beside a bridge, seemingly by the hand of the flesh tree at the end of the catacombs with a large white mask. This is the Prince of Reinhardt II, and seemingly was next in line for the royal throne. I know the naming scheme of this graveyard is confusing, but Reinhardt II isn't the last king the game is referring to. That wouldn't make sense given we don't know a Reinhardt I who had to start the lineage. This burial floor is actually intended for the first King Reinhardt, but ironically used by the second as well, and eventually for the third. The prince has gained ultimate corrupting power, possibly through a pact with the demons we see on floor 5, or by a rift of darkness opened up during an expedition that overtook the prince. Regardless, he now seeks our holy moonlight sword, the only thing that can defeat him. Without such a weapon, or the power of the other dragon artifacts, we would stand little chance against this massive beast that hurls dozens of different projectiles, even spawning enemies to shoot even more projectiles at us. The boss fight is incredibly chaotic. You'll likely have to pause and heal often, as projectile damage can stack quickly and easily kill you. After many Moonlight Sword swings, the evil that lies in the royal graveyard disintegrates into dust, and we can leave this place in peace, knowing that the land is purified of corruption. The path to the Dark World was closed. The battle was won and only the legend lived on in Verdite. However, someday one might strive to open the doors once again to its corrupting call. John, having his dream to surpass his father realized, set aside his sorrow and departs from the kingdom, although he could easily take the throne of power if he so wished, and in the future he might be called back to its tumultuous lands once again. For now though, we are our own king, in our own field. And that ending theme, yes, alongside peace and light, good music has finally returned to Verdite. As I said, the story of Kingsfield 1 is nothing super special. The gameplay and exploration sure carries it, but I like to explore the little bits of lore it did have, as that was the most interesting part of Kingsfield 4 to me. The best part of Kingsfield 1 is that it paves the way for the future sequels. We'll get to see the developing story of Verdite together.
Kingsfield 1 was a great opener. The fucking skeleton is attacking me again. Kingsfield 1 was a great opener for the franchise. It's a short and sweet dungeon crawler that left me wanting more. With its great exploration and puzzle solving that helped spice up the game from its rather average combat system. It doesn't excel in most fields. Thank you. No. I'm just the messenger here. But what it lacks in polish, it makes up for in experimentation. Always introducing new puzzles and combat encounters to make the game feel unique across its 5 different floors. It also shines on its personality. Sure, the story isn't much, but the characters are goofy in their names alone. It has unique and sometimes threatening enemy designs and a well-structured map that pulls everything together. It's a game that clearly had passion poured into it, which rubs off on you, the player, in turn saving it from being just a regular, average, bland dungeon crawler. And despite its lacking story, I'm really excited to see how it unfolds across the next 2 entries. If the lore is half as decent as Kingsfield 4 was, then it's going to be a hell of a ride. Thank you for watching, and subscribe if you want to, because I'm going to be expanding this video series to the rest of the Kingsfield franchise, and eventually Shadow Tower after that. I've already made a lengthy video on Kingsfield 4, one of my favorite games, so you're welcome to check that one out right away. But that has been the story of John King Fields. Thank you for watching.